Welcome, Chameleon Wranglers, to Season 8 of the Chameleon Academy podcast. You've come to the place where we discuss the art and science of chameleon keeping. We explore, share, and go beyond just keeping a pet, learning about the world through our love for these modern-day dragons. This is the Chameleon Academy podcast, and I'm your host, Bill Strand. My name is Bill Strand, and I'm excited to kick this off, and a little apprehensive, as this is my most aggressive season ever. And by aggressive, I mean with the whole variety of outreaches that will be going on. There will be some form of Chameleon Academy outreach each day of the week. But you did not come here for a bunch of housekeeping talk. You came here to kick off Season 8 with a rundown of my recent trip to Madagascar. So we will save the talk about outreach methods for the end, where the true believers remain. But let's just say that if you want chameleon education, you came to the right place. So let's get on with the show. This is a unique episode in that I'm writing it from the forest of Andasibe, Madagascar. I have had an incredible 2 weeks of exploring forests that are the home of the 23 species of chameleons we cited. But more important than a species count, I was able to feel what the forests were like, both highland and lowland. I was able to feel the soils where chameleons laid their eggs. Of course, I consult with scientists and world-traveling herpers all the time. But there is nothing like being there yourself, seeing it with your own eyes, feeling it, and even hearing it. Today, I would like to share with you what I learned while here in Madagascar. To summarize the trip would be a Herculean task, so today I'm going to focus on what I learned. But you can be sure elements of this trip will infuse themselves in podcasts and videos for the rest of the season. Now, just to set the stage, I had an incredible group that I went with. You may recognize many of these prominent YouTubers. Dion from Reptiliatus, Dave Kaufman from Dave Kaufman's Reptile Adventures, Adam Wickens from Wickens Wicked Reptiles, and Mike Taitula from Alpha Reptile. Also with us was Alec Brown, DVM, because it's always good to have a herp vet with you no matter where you are. And then there was Nadim, who's a professional videographer, and he was there to support these YouTubers to get some great footage. The whole trip was led by Patrick Andrea Mihaja, who is an experienced guide in Madagascar. My trip covered the Ranamafana rainforests, Ambalavavo, Andasibe, and Palmarium. You'll have to forgive my pronunciation of some of those. I know it's atrocious, but I'm practicing. Those names may be unfamiliar to you, but they are regions in central eastern Madagascar. The interesting thing was that you don't need to go to a national park or even the forests to see chameleons. A number of species have adapted to human encroachment and can be found along the bramble bushy areas and second-growth forests lining the roadways. And this is where we were able to find Furcifer minor, Furcifer lateralis, Furcifer major, and Furcifer usuleti. So even though the national parks could be a day's drive away from each other, we would be stopping along the way whenever someone spotted a chameleon. There was rarely a dull moment. A definite highlight of my trip was the Ranamafana rainforest. That is the area where I saw Kaluma's parsoni, Loshonacei, Crypticum, Malthae, Tias mantoi, and Gastrotania. There was Furcifer balteatus and Bruchisia superciliaris and Theli. The internet reception was surprisingly good, and I was actually able to do live streams with my Instagram audience. Of course, those are still there now, and so go check them out if you didn't see them. I was not expecting to be able to do that, but it really helped as I was able to communicate in real time with Dr. Mark Schertz to help identify the species of the Kaluma nasutum complex. Mark and I discussed the need for some sort of ID guide for this confusing group of chameleons, and so we are in discussions on how to make that happen for the entire community to reference. I was very happy to be able to find the satanic leaf-tailed gecko, Euryplatus fantasticus, and Euryplatus sicore. Add to that a chorus of Indri lemurs, and my experience was full. There were two major things I took away from my time in Ranamafana. The first was the humidity. It was high during the day, and during the night, It was so thick that I could hardly see across the park road to the trees across the way because of the mist. I am deliberately not sharing number data because I want to talk concepts. We can get numbers in many places. What was worth the long flight to literally the other side of the earth was so I could feel it. And I felt something that numbers cannot convey. The humidity was very high, but it didn't feel stuffy. It didn't feel oppressive. Sure, I was a sticky mess because no sweat would evaporate in the high humidity, but the air felt vibrant. And so I'll be trying to recreate this feeling in the combination of misters, foggers, and fans at home to try and replicate what I felt. Now, there really wasn't any flash of enlightenment. The natural hydration cycle that's on every Chameleon Academy care guide describes how to implement what I felt. But when you feel it, it adds a completely different dimension to the ability to implement it. One thing that did change the way I see things was that I found a number of species sleeping at the end of thin branches, which is exactly what I expected. But when we disturbed them for filming, none of them dropped off the branch. And this is significant for me because I thought that we give chameleons thin branches for them to feel safe, which is true, and that they use thin branches so they can be inaccessible to predators, which is true, and they would drop to the forest floor if they detected vibrations on the branch. Well, the chameleons I saw were sleeping at the end of thin branches, but none of them dropped to escape being disturbed by us photographers. So, time to get to the bottom of where that information came from. I checked around with some trusted field-experienced chameleon researchers and confirmed that yes, there were some species that were flighty and would drop easily as described, but some would actually grab their branches harder. So there is an unexpected insight, and so I will amend what I say to chameleons like to sleep at the end of thin branches so that they are inaccessible to predators. And I just had to fly to Madagascar to get that correction. Another personal growth moment was when I asked why there was so much sunshine during the wet season. I had this vision of a lot more rain. It turns out that the rainy season, at least in central eastern Madagascar, means sunshine and clear skies for much of the day, but patches of rainfall suddenly dousing everything. As soon as the rain started, we all took cover, but it was expected that it would be over soon and we could resume, and that's the way most of our trip went. That was, of course, until the cyclone hit, and then there was a lot of rain, pounding, and it gave us no sunshine. One thing that got me thinking was the height at which I saw some of the smaller Kaluma and Brookesia. We often have this perception that smaller chameleons live closer to the ground, and that's not necessarily the case. I saw the couple-inch-long Kaluma tiasmantoi, and this is from the tiny Nasutum complex, but I saw them perched high in the trees. Which brings up the idea that these little chameleons may do okay in smaller cages, but maybe we should be giving them a 2x2 by 4 foot cage as well. I think the feeling that we don't want a small chameleon in such a large space is something we need to get over. Regardless of how big the chameleon is, it really takes a certain amount of space volume for us to be able to effectively create gradients and microclimates. Now, I think it may be an overreaction to say the stump-tailed chameleon Brookesia superciliaris needs a 2x2 by 4 cage, but they do like to be in bushes above the ground, so let's start giving it a little bit more thought. And if you really like Brookesia or these small Kaluma, don't worry about giving them a large cage. They will love it. And let's talk about the rainy season. Those of us far from the equator experience our seasons as variations of hot and cold. Around the equator, including Madagascar, the seasons are more identified by rainy and dry. Though Madagascar does experience a difference in temperature in the rainy and dry seasons, you may be surprised to hear that the dry season is actually colder than the wet season. We tend to associate dry with hot deserts, but in reality, amount of moisture is not tied to temperature. These kind of distinctions are important for those of us working on the concept of adding dry season conditions to our husbandry. Anyway, people searching for chameleons usually come during the rainy season because that is when chameleons are most active. With the rain comes ample insect life for food. This is when the babies hatch, grow, mate, and lay eggs that will hatch when the next wet season comes. Eggs need to be in the ground and the chameleons grown enough that they will survive that dry season. There just isn't a whole lot of water available, and the chameleons react in ways that go from the extreme of dying at the end of the wet season to hiding in holes or tree crevices or hunkering down to wait for the next fog to deposit dew on the leaves so they can drink. I have come during the rainy season and during our first stop in the Ranamafana National Park. I really wanted to contemplate my hydration techniques. This is where Parsonii, O'Shaughnessy, and Crypticum live, and what I found was no surprise. Everything is wet there. It does not get much chance to dry out during the day with the high humidity and regular rain bursts, and of course, the chameleons are surrounded by moisture during the night. So how does this fit in with the naturalistic hydration method I outline in the Chameleon Academy Care Guides? And yes, this is exactly why I've come. I am constantly challenging my husbandry approaches. So let's compare. Generally, I recommend less humid days, around 50%, and no misting unless you're implementing an afternoon rain shower. Now, that seems to be a deviation from what I see in the wild. And that is true, because I was getting humidities up to 85% during the day. And of course, rain bursts. Unfortunately, there are compromises we have to make in the confined spaces of a standard hybrid cage. We need the surfaces to dry out so we don't get bacterial or fungal growths. So those care parameters are deviating from nature. And this would go against my main guiding philosophy, as my goal is to get our husbandry closer to nature. But this is a case where I recognize the compromise. I know that this compromise works, but I also know that there's still work to be done. We need to work on establishing ventilation methods that allow high humidity nights and the airflow to make sure it's not an oppressive humidity. And that definitely is a way that we can move forward. We need to figure out a way to get that high humidity without stagnant air. And yes, this is on the list of things I'll be working on this year. The option is not to use a screen cage because then you lose all the humidity. Many people use fans successfully, and I've used fans successfully, but before it goes on a care guide, I need to do the Chameleon Academy filter on it to know it so well that I can make a formula of sorts with it. The point is that whatever I present can't just be something that I've been able to create in my setup. It needs to be able to be reproduced by the wide range of people in the chameleon community. You ever wonder why I present the same internal cage structure that I have been for the last 10 years? First of all, the floating garden-style interior using the dragon ledges is effective and attractive. But the real value of that template is that it is easy for anyone to replicate. And that is what I work to go for with anything I present here. So just saying add fans for ventilation is not good enough. I need to be able to describe it in ways that even the beginner can implement it and implement it correctly. Therefore, I have some work ahead of me, so stay tuned. Now, the highlight of the trip was two events that happened actually the same day in Palmarium. And this is south of Tamatov. It was this day that I was able to see freshly hatched panther chameleons scattering. And I watched a female panther chameleon digging her egg-laying hole. These are two events a guide could never promise to see, and ones that were the most special part of the trip. For the babies, I came across a stand of ferns along a trail that the rest of the group was using to interact with lemurs. These were wild lemurs, but on the grounds had come to realize that humans were no threat and often had bananas hidden on their person. So they had no problem jumping on us and crawling all over. It was an incredible experience. But I had separated from the group, distracted by looking for chameleons. Lemurs are cute and all, but some of us have important work to do. We had found baby chameleons around, but this find was special because I found hatchlings that still had the signature white sand stuck to their body. So I knew these were freshly hatched babies, and I saw them scattering. Unfortunately, I was not able to find the exact place where they were digging from. I would have loved to see that. I was not successful finding it, but it wasn't for lack of trying. I did dig through the soil in the area and found it very sandy and easy to dig through. Lots of thin roots made it annoying to try and make a hole with my big hands, but it would be no problem for a chameleon digging out. Now, this was seemingly in contrast to the female I found later that afternoon who had decided that the walking trail was a spot for her to deposit eggs. In the early afternoon, we came across a female panther chameleon digging a hole on the forest path. This path is a trail through the forest, which is composed of that well-draining sand that was essentially everywhere around there. The curious thing was that she selected a spot with absolutely no cover, so she was vulnerable to any predator that came to check things out. In addition, the trail's sandy soil was packed pretty hard, so it was difficult to dig through. I dug a hole nearby to check it out, and that was some pretty packed soil. I was surprised that she chose this digging spot when she had a whole forest behind her of easier-to-dig soil that had cover while she was on the ground vulnerable. But I'm glad for her decision, as I was able to observe her digging. Members of my group joined me to watch her and wanted to get video of the event. If we were careful, we were safe to do this while her head was deep in the hole. But we knew as soon as she came up to turn around to deposit eggs that we would have to go. Unfortunately, she was pretty quick about turning around once she had reached the desired depth, and she caught us around her. We immediately froze, but the disturbance was done, and she took off to crawl up the nearest tree. We totally left the area after I did a very quick depth check of the hole and found she had dug 3 inches down. So if we assume about an inch of egg mass, that would mean that the babies would have 2 inches of soil to dig through. I came back 2.5 hours later and was very pleased to see that she had returned to her hole and completed the laying process. I caught her filling the hole back up, took a few pictures to document it, and left her to complete the job. Now, what can we take away from this observation? The first of 2 big points was that if disturbed, the female may return to the hole in the wild. We have observed this phenomena in captivity, but it was unclear whether that is because we offer very limited spaces. So, in captivity, it'd be easier to find the hole again. But this observation goes to show that she will return even with the entire landmass of Madagascar to choose from to dig a second hole. Though, honestly, considering chameleons are not built for digging holes, if I were her, I wouldn't look forward to starting another hole anytime soon. So it makes sense that she would not want to give up on her hard work. The second was that she only dug 3 inches down. This just confirms what I had observed in semi-wild conditions with large outdoor enclosures and discussions with Madagascar field scientists that they dig relatively shallow holes. This is important because we in the captive community have had a history of giving deep containers of perfect soil to dig through, which just wore the females out trying to dig to the firm levels to lay their eggs, and then have the danger of the tunnel collapsing. I would have loved to have found the nest where the babies were hatching from to see how deep that hole was, because the soil in that area did not have a firm layer a couple of inches down. So when would they know to stop digging in that soil? Is that where they start looking for a root ball? And was there anything particular about the digging sites? We know in captivity that panthers aren't that picky as far as where they lay. You can give them a perfect laying bin and they are just as likely to lay their eggs in the pothos plant pot. There has to be some sort of selection process they go through to decide where to dig. But how selective is it? I still have so many questions about this. But I am taking home some ideas to try out. The hole depth confirms that laying bins are effective at 4 to 6 inches deep. We already know that. And after this trip, I'm going to try a 6-inch deep container with 2 inches of clay soil at the bottom to be a dense layer. On top of that will be 4 inches of sandy soil. Now, I usually just do a thin layer of pure sand on top because that makes it very easy to see where the eggs were placed if I missed the event. I just look for the disturbed part of the sandy surface. But I'd like to try an area that has a top that includes decaying leaves. So I will experiment with a laying bin that has good drainage and maybe stay in the cage permanently. I'll see how much that is selected by the different species. Now, to be clear, this is just an idea that needs to be extensively tested before I present it as something the world should try. I am humble enough to realize that chameleon breeders have been coming to Madagascar for decades with the exact same purpose as I did, and they have observed the same things I have. And so far, there has been no one saying that a layer of detritus, or decaying leaves, helps with laying. That doesn't mean I shouldn't try it out, and it doesn't mean that I won't discover something that no one else has before me. It just means that I need to test it out before I broadcast this idea as a conclusion. The only reason I am sharing it with you at this point is to bring you along the process of confirmation, and hopefully be a good example of how to apply critical thinking and testing to a hypothesis before blasting it all over social media. Ideas are cheap. Dime a dozen. Buy me a Starbucks iced coffee and I'll give you 15 right then and there. Make it a venti and I'll throw in some anecdotal support by some unnamed expert vet and a sworn testimony from my cousin's hairdresser whose boyfriend had a chameleon experience. On the other hand, Hypotheses that have had a basic level of confirmation from testing, and only then are presented for other keepers to do further testing, are gold for our community advancement. So I have an idea. I'm going to test it with side-by-side examples and only one variable different, and then across different species. I will then try and prove it wrong. If I am unable to prove it wrong, I will present it to a small set of community members to have them try it out. And with the results from those other keepers, I will feel comfortable presenting it to the entire community and including it as part of the Chameleon Academy body of knowledge. Whew, that's a lot of work. But it sure makes for a higher quality information exchange amongst a social media community that loves to run with any new idea. So now, how about you? I'd like to encourage any of you who have had an interest in going to see chameleons in Madagascar to make it happen. I fully understand how intimidating it is, and if you are in the U.S., you may only have 2 weeks of vacation to work with, and when travel can be 2 days either way, this becomes a major financial and time investment. This may very well be the only time off you are able to take in a year, so it may truly be a once-in-a-lifetime experience for you. And if it is going to be a once-in-a-lifetime experience, then go ahead and make it happen. From personal experience, I can say the biggest roadblock is knowing where to start, so perhaps I can smooth that part over for you, because this would be an incredible experience for any chameleon enthusiast. Luckily, Madagascar has a well-established tourism industry with guides that specialize in chameleons and other wildlife. If you would like to have a recommendation, I'll put a link to the contact information for my guide, Patrick Andriamihaja, in the show notes. Just message him and tell him your story. Say you listen to Bill's podcast. Tell him you love chameleons and you want to come to Madagascar, and what do I need to do to make this happen? The benefit of mentioning that you heard about him via this podcast is that I've already told him about my listeners and that they may have zero idea what to ask for, so he's ready to help you figure something out from ground zero. You can put together a group of your friends or else see if there's room in a group that's already going. He knows he may be helping you with everything. And hey, if we wanted to put together a Chameleon Academy group for 2024, I'd be open for that discussion. Anybody want to do it? The wonderful thing about Madagascar is that you don't have to worry about the wildlife. Okay, there may be some wasps here or there, but there's no venomous snakes besides some rear-fanged fellows, and there are no large mammals that could consider you lunch. Crocodiles do exist on the island, but this isn't a situation where you'll accidentally run into them in the Runamafana rainforest. All this may seem strange to consider, but just listen to the podcast episode I did with Carl Coteau about his exploring Tanzania and having to have armed guards to make sure a leopard didn't make a meal out of him, and you start appreciating the ability to walk aimlessly around at night with your flashlight shining in the trees looking for chameleons. So, should you go? Well, yes. Should you look into it now? Well, that's another yes. Check the show notes for Season 8, Episode 1 on February 3rd, 2023 for links to Patrick, who will guide you from knowing nothing to knowing the steps to go forward. And once again, if enough Chameleon Academy listeners want to go, well, I have no problem going again. It wouldn't be a Chameleon Academy event, but I could certainly smooth the way and provide scintillating conversation throughout the trip. The theme for this Season 8 of the Chameleon Academy podcast is growth. Throughout the season, I'm going to be talking about the directions we need to grow as a community and directions you can grow as an individual keeper if you so desire. There is no requirement that you go beyond the basics of keeping a chameleon healthy and happy, but if chameleons have fascinated you and you want to explore deeper into the chameleon arts, then you're in exactly the right place. Going to Madagascar was a step in my personal growth. I have relied on other people for my knowledge of the wild conditions. Sure, I've seen chameleons in South Africa and Florida, but when I need to go in depth on a subject concerning chameleons in the wild, I bring on names like Mark Schertz, Peter Netchas, Chris Anderson, Jan Stapala, Ewan Edwards, Carl Coteau, and that's quite the list of supporting people. But that's what it takes. I mean, you can't be an in-depth expert on everything. It just isn't realistic. And you need wide support if you're going to talk on big things. I have deep specialization in captive husbandry methods and the understanding of them within the community. I'm fully aware of my strengths, and I'm fully aware of where I need to strengthen. And this trip was a big step in the direction I need to go. Now, this one trip hardly makes me an expert on chameleon observations in the wild. I still have that consultation team and will lean on them heavily. But this trip does help me better understand their answers to my questions and to come up with better questions. And like any form of personal growth, it's one step at a time, and it will not happen overnight. We all need to be patient and kind with ourselves. And you too, all right? Don't think you need to be expert right away. It takes time, and just enjoy the process of growing. So this was my growth point. This is where I am in my journey. And this year's theme, appropriately, will be growth. The communities and individually. And so, how will the Chameleon Academy offer growth opportunities for you? Great question. Here is what Season 8 will look like. The Chameleon Academy outreach for 2023 will be a podcast episode every other week and a Chameleon Hour YouTube video every other week. So this will offer both an in-depth audio experience and a fun chameleon variety show. I'm having too much fun with both, so we will have both this year. Doing each every other week makes it manageable for this one mortal trying to live two lives in the span of one. I will have weekly live interactive sessions on both Instagram, Tuesday evenings 5 p.m. Pacific on Instagram, and the Chameleons and Coffee Show on YouTube Live every Saturday afternoon at 12 noon Pacific. Of course, always check the times. They may change, but that's what they've been for 2022 and are working pretty well for me. And various Instagram posts and stories, YouTube videos, and blog posts through the week. And I admit that's a lot to keep track of. So you can review the schedule by signing up for the free Chameleon Academy newsletter, which comes out once a week and discusses what has gone on and what will go on the next week in the Chameleon Academy outreach. You can find the newsletter sign-up link on the homepage of chameleonacademy.com. And finally, if you want to have a more in-depth discussion or question answered than the standard social media private message or Instagram story question allows, then I invite you to join the Chameleon Academy Patreon, where I take my Patreon's personal growth in the chameleon arts seriously. Each week we will have a discussion topic and more in-depth answers to questions than you get elsewhere. Sometimes the discussion topic is the podcast episode a week early, and sometimes it's a custom video topic. I like to switch it up for variety. And I want to thank all of the current patrons that are supporting the Chameleon Academy outreach right now. I appreciate you very much. Most of you joined not to get any special perks, but just to support my public outreach. I can't tell you what that support gesture means to me. Thank you. And now it is time to sign off. My trip to Madagascar has been a very special trip. There are a number of things that are still on my personal growth list that involve Madagascar, so chances are good that I will be back one or two more times. But I need to reconnect with my family before starting the second trip plans. I have quite the return trip ahead of me, bouncing from Madagascar to Kenya and across the Atlantic, but that is for tomorrow. Right now, I'm simply enjoying being here amongst the chameleons and lemurs. I thank you for joining me here and sharing my experience. I look forward to this next year of celebrating the joy of chameleons and pushing our husbandry horizons. Take care, and I'll see you next time. This is your host, Bill Strand, signing off. Go into the world and soak up everything it has to offer. Learn, understand, and pass it on. This is our community. Take care of each other and keep us strong. I'll see you next time on the Chameleon Academy Podcast.